Good morning, everyone. You are joining the COVID-19 mitigation considerations for tournaments, brought to you by Go for Ellis. We're going to give everybody about another 60 to 90 seconds to join us, and then we'll get started. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Andy Hayes. I am the founder and CEO of Go for Ellis. Today, we're going to talk about COVID-19 mitigation considerations, specifically at tournaments. This is webinar number 4 in our series. I strongly suggest that you review our other 3 webinars. Our first one was with John Sadler on insurance and liability. The second webinar was on how to run a camp and COVID-19 mitigation considerations for camps and clinics and practices. Our third one was this new opportunity that's arisen for both ATs, and frankly, it's an excellent resource for event operators, specifically on tournaments, is a COVID-19 coordinator. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm joined today by Ellis Mayer. Ellis is the Chief Medical Officer at Go for Ellis. Before this, she's been an athletic trainer at Boston University, Penn State, Monsignor Bonner High School. She also was the Director of Health and Participant Safety for Next Sports, and is my fellow founder here at Go for Ellis. So today we're going to talk a lot about tournaments, and specifically our objectives are going to be pre-tournament planning for COVID-19 mitigation considerations and executing the tournament with these considerations as well. And as you're going to quickly see, as Ellis adds her perspective in here, the planning in the pre-event is going to be most important. However, before we get to that, there are so many resources out there, and we strongly suggest that you follow the lead of authority sources. First and foremost, the CDC on May 19th published an exhaustive 68-page manual for considerations for youth sports. But we also believe that the state and local authorities and their public health departments are the ones that you primarily need to follow. You can monitor websites, emails, and social media from your sports governing and sanctioning bodies. That will also give you some help in terms of returning to play. But we feel very strongly that if you're going to run a tournament this summer, you need to be in touch with the local and county health department and talk about what your plan is and get their guidance specific. Because as we know, holding a tournament in the middle of Texas is way different than holding a tournament in the middle of New Jersey or Delaware. So before we go any further, please check your local and county authorities and health departments. So we're going to start this is the biggest topic of the day. It's about pre-tournament. So, okay, we've made a decision to put on a tournament. What do we need to consider? And I think given my background as an event operator, not only working with Ellis, in a safety capacity, will kind of give a perspective on, listen, the event operators need to put their tournaments on. It's part of their business. And so how do we safely do that? And so there might be a couple opportunities through the webinar to see both perspectives, which we think is important. So to start, I'm going to kick this over to Ellis to talk about the tactical things that you need to be aware of as a tournament operator in the COVID-19 environment.
Thank you, Andy. So I'd like to re-stress the fact that Andy just put out there is that you really need to read every regulation and guideline out there. The CDC is putting out things, your state is putting out things, your county might be putting out things, your city might be putting out different recommendations. So really making sure you're reviewing every regulation and recommendation that's coming out. Just today, I read that St. Louis is allowing tournaments to happen. However, they are not allowing teams within the metro area to travel outside the metro area. Kentucky is allowing indoor sports at a 50% capacity as long as there's 6 feet of social distancing that can happen. Texas, the Governor Abbott said, so on the other side, so those are some places that are examples that are starting to open up and allow for more participation in sports. But Governor Abbott down in Texas said further action will be necessary if they can't get control of the surge that's currently going on down in Texas. So you just need to remember that all of these guidelines are changing hour by hour, day by day. It's completely different in St. Louis than it is in Texas, than it is in Philadelphia. So even I talked to an event operator recently where all the regulations around the Bay Area are different by county, and how they want you to set up a field is different by county. So there's a lot of different recommendations out there, and I want you to make sure that you're reviewing them all and making sure that you're on board with all of them and submitting your plan. So one of the other things you really need to do is a risk assessment. So thinking about your sport specifically, what are the rules of your sport? What are the layouts of your tournament normally? We'll get into that in a little bit. And how can you reduce contact? So physical contact, how can you reduce contact with other objects? How can you reduce contact between people? So these are all things that you need to think about in this pre-event phase of planning. The pre-event phase of planning should be weeks long. Understanding that the tournament could be a one-day event, you need to really go through and fully do a whole diagnosis and evaluation of your event going into it. This is something you need to work with the event operator, or the event operator needs to work with their athletic trainer. They can help hire a COVID-19 coordinator to help you kind of go through all these cumbersome regulations, but really coming up with a plan and then shopping that plan around to all of the stakeholders. So if Annie and I were to come up with a plan by ourselves, we might think this is perfect. And then we submit it to our coaches and our club directors that are coming to our tournament, and they might have a slew of questions from where they're coming from. So this is something that you really need to make sure you're interviewing and involving the stakeholders of everybody that's going to be involved in your tournament. Same thing, you want everything that once you create your plan, shop it around, you've kind of approved it, everybody's gone through it. You want to make sure you communicate that out. So pre-event communication is huge. So if you won't be providing water on the venue because it's a high contact site, that needs to be communicated to the parents that are going to be bringing their children to your tournament. Staff safety is a huge piece of this too. So this shouldn't just be like a 10-minute meeting in the morning. This should be a full-on onboarding of what is expected of your tournament staff that day, who has what roles within the tournament. And you really need to think of everybody. So remember that there are people that aren't necessarily always in the front of our minds for communication. So whether it's your athletic trainers that are on site, making sure that they have reviewed the plan and that they're on board. Referees are another group that we don't always think about right away, but they're another group that some of them could be of an older age and might be in this at-risk population. So you really need to take into account, how are you going to be taking care of your referees as well? Supply purchases. This is something, as we all know, especially our athletic trainers out there, supplies right now are in flux. They're hard to get. They can be expensive. So this is one of the first things on your checklist that you should be really thinking and ordering ahead of time is what supplies are we going to need for the day of the event, and try and get those things ordered and shipped as soon as possible. Do you have anything to add, Andy?
The one thing I would say from an event operator perspective, the supplies thing, I just want to make sure that all of our viewers, the reason that Ellis is harping on the supplies thing is because as we get into the details of all the stakeholders, staff, participant, really the event operator needs to have these supplies ahead of time. It's not on the medical professional to bring. All right, this is part of your operations budget, or it certainly would be for me. And so, part of, I think what Ellis is talking, about blocking and tackling here is, one of the big things that John Sadler said about insurance and liability in webinar 1 was that you needed to have a plan in writing, communicated to everybody so that everybody knows what that plan is. And that is what's going to help you if, some sort of event happens at your event. And I think that's really important. And so this planning, can't stress this enough from an event operator side, like you need to get on this immediately. Specifically, I'm going to get started here, Ellis, just from an event operator. If I was running a tournament, like I need to sit down with one of the maps of the venues and I need to look at everything on that map. Okay. So everyone sends out a tournament map, a field map, all of those things, or it's on an app now. You really need to start thinking about like where are all these people going to come together. Okay. And I'm going to let Ellis talk a little specifically about what a contact audit specifically is. But as an event operator, like you need, I think a venue map is more important than ever before.
Absolutely. And that can be in our first phase of planning. So we're going to look at our venue map and we're going to think about how people move. So crowd dynamics and the crowd flow is going to be very important. I say crowd, using that just as a general term, but thinking about how many people are you allowing? So is it one parent per child? Is it two parents per child? Are you allowing vendors? If so, where are they going to be set up? And which we'll get a little bit into vendors later. But so really looking at your venue, the setup of your venue, and thinking about how people normally move within your venue, and then how you can alter that behavior or help guide that behavior. So whether it's with some visual cues like signage, or if it's with cattle shoots, similar to what they have in stadiums. Or I know another event operator of ours used police tape just around a field. So it was able to kind of guide the flow of where he wanted people to be and stand and how drop-offs would work. You also just want to do points of regular contact. So thinking about how doorknobs and how often they'll be sanitized, and thinking about bathrooms, which we'll get into in a little bit too, but really thinking about a contact audit of person to person. So is there do you normally have a registration where somebody walks up and has to have a physical conversation with one of your staff members? Maybe we get rid of that somehow. Maybe you don't need to check in as a team. And that way that limits that face-to-face contact with one of your staff members doing an intake of all the teams that are participating. Do you have anything to add, Andy?
Oh, that's great. So here we go. Perfect example. I mean, we don't need to get into, we can talk about basic biology if we want to, but the bottom line is if there's more people in an area, the greater the infection rate can happen with COVID-19. It's an extremely infectious virus. So our first sort of goal here is to limit the number of participants. So how do you do that? Is it a parent and guardian per field, one referee per field, limiting team assistant coaches? Again, that gets a little trickier when we start talking about ages, and I'm going to let Ellis kind of talk about, we kind of had a little disagreement on this. I think that, you've got to find a way to limit the number of the people on your field, vulnerable populations, and it might be as simple as like persons over 65 shouldn't be there. Well, here's the challenge with that. If you're going to put that in writing and put that out ahead of time, how are you going to enforce that? Just something to think about. And then just from the legal liability, if you have vendors at vendor villages and vendors, which frankly probably aren't a good idea this summer, but if you do that, what are you doing to assure that those people are in fact not carrying the virus or becoming a problem with all the people attending your event? So specifically, we talk about COVID-19 waivers. We talk about different things like that later in the webinar. You really need to think about who is everybody that's going to be on the grounds of your tournament. And Ellis called them stakeholders, and you got to start there and work backwards. And then again, that comes with planning ahead of time. Ellis, I know you have a couple pretty hardcore feelings about the participants.
Yeah, exactly. So the number of people and who is going to be on site is important. And I think that you need to be mindful of staffing and then the roles that everybody has and their importance. So this is a situation where overstaffing might be a good thing. However, it does you no good to have lots of staff that's poorly trained. So if you have just a million runners who are all sitting in a golf cart together, then that's not helpful for anybody, and you're just transmitting or potentially having more points of contact. So making sure that you have the appropriate amount of staff. There's a couple things on the slide that actually Andy and I disagreed with. So I look at it as like a patient standpoint, less people, the better. However, if we think about it from a safety standpoint too, if we're having one referee per field, now we're thinking about maybe less concussion recognition going on, maybe less calls or more calls being missed that could end up with altercations. So thinking about, like, I view a referee as an arm of the safety team. So I don't know if I personally would limit referees on a field. Maybe that's something that other people disagree with, but I think that they're kind of one of our, they are socially distant mostly all the time. They're barely you don't even notice them for the most part. So I think that limiting referees might be up for debate. Limiting team assistant coaches. This is another one that Andy and I agreed on or disagreed on earlier. My feeling with that is it kind of depends on the age and it depends on the sport. So our younger groups, there might be a little bit harder. So harder to enforce social distancing and other safety practices. So if you have some extra assistant coaches on the sideline, making sure everybody is 6 feet away, making sure that nobody's sharing water bottles, things like that, that can they can crowd manage their own team as opposed to having no help for that one coach who's actually focused on the game and subbing at the time. There are other sports where we typically see, whether it's basketball, you'll see 12 players and lots of assistant coaches. So maybe if you think of like a coach to roster ratio, that might be a better way of approaching this. Another thing on the slide that I thought about too is that not letting people that are over a certain age might not work for all of our population. Some people's guardians or just parents are older than and are part of the at-risk population. So you need to think about the patient here and what is in the best needs of the patient, and making sure that if they want or need their parent there, that they're allowed to be there. But we're trying to limit the amount of people that are going to be on site to try and limit the amount of potential transmission points. Film vendor was another one, Andy, that we disagreed on. So do you want to talk about that from a business standpoint?
Yeah, no, and I don't think we necessarily disagreed on it. I think the issue here is that, listen, there is these operators, these event operators, these tournament providers, these club coaches. You know, there is a business side of this, and so film vendors in particular. Again, and Ellis, I'm not disagreeing with you on the safety stuff here. If you can confirm that these people are and signed off on that they don't have any symptoms and all of those things, then I find that live streaming games is a way to potentially keep less people, or excuse me, to keep less people in the actual tournament venue, and maybe they're watching online. If you're a recruiting event, college coaches, now I know there's a big the recruiting world right now is completely in disarray about can they be there, can they not, all of those things. And the challenge there is that they're governed by their schools. So to me, your film vendor, if I'm going to hire a film vendor, I would live stream games in the hopes that would have more people watching from afar. However, it creates a massive safety issue because you now have a vendor coming into your bubble who primarily wasn't part of your planning session, right? Was not trained on any of these things. And they're telling you that everybody's, so what's their plan? What do they do? And so now I just set you up, Alice. Go ahead.
No, and I agree with you that I do like the idea of potentially live streaming if that's possible to reduce crowds. So maybe you will have less kind of carpooling or more carpooling, or so kids will be more dropped off as opposed, and their parents can watch from a distance. So I do understand that, and I actually like that idea. But I think this is, again, part of this pre-event phase that you need to find the right film vendor, ask what their mechanics are, what does their typical setup look like, what are their needs. Some film vendors are doing really cool stuff with robotic cameras that just follow the ball. So there's maybe just one person managing all the equipment or 3 people managing all the equipment. So I think that you need to get an understanding of film and film vendors and understand how many people are going to be involved in this situation. But I do like the idea of potentially, if the resources are there, that is a good way to limit crowds.
So another big one is like scheduling, and this is the bane of every tournament operator's existence. But I mean, at the bare minimum, you need to be block scheduling If you don't know what that is, that means that you have a group of people there in the morning or a group of people there in the afternoon. They play one on, one off, one on, one off. Some of the other tournament operators that I've seen and been talking to has suggested they're playing back to back. So you play 2 games in a row and then you're out, to limit the amount of time there, right? To minimize the window for participants' arrival time and then encourage participants to leave quickly after their game. The one thing with this that you also, where this interfaces with your venue and contact audit, is like, what's the parking situation? How are you going to drop people off? How are you going to move people around? This crowd management is going to be, this is part of that on how you schedule. And we're going to talk a little bit about specifically the field layouts and what that should look like in a little bit. But the scheduling of the actual event, and I would hope that everyone on the club side and your participants are going to understand what's going on here, and how challenging this is for an event operator. But I strongly suggest that your scheduling is part of your plan.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Scheduling is very important. Again, it's a nice way to be able to get, it's a nice way to execute cohorting. So keeping our teams in smaller groups, only exposing a smaller amount. Another thing you could potentially think about too, which I just came up with this one, Andy, let's see if you like it or not, is where one of the things that everybody wants to keep in mind as we start working our way into tournaments and travel tournaments is that not necessarily taking your team from Connecticut to a tournament in Virginia, right? So we're supposed to kind of be thinking about geography as we are re-examining youth sports and travel sports. So potentially maybe if you have the New Jersey teams that are near each other playing each other and maybe not cross-state things, so we're not intermixing too many different communities at our tournaments. So maybe that's a different idea for block scheduling too, is taking into account where people come from. Some club directors might not be happy with that because they play that team all the time, but really this is something you need to think about as far as cohorting goes and really organizing your tournament in a way to try and minimize the amount of contact in between different groups. Arrival time is huge, and that is going to be handled completely different. I've already heard of one event operator doing a completely parentless tournament, no spectators. So the kids get dropped off with their coaches and that's it. So that is going to be a long car line if you think about that. So really thinking about the mechanics of drop off and pickup. And I can only imagine what pickup looks like at the end of a tournament with that many kids trying to find their parents wandering around a parking lot. That's a whole nother safety issue that I'm thinking about. So really trying to organize drop off and pickup is a huge part of this as well. And then the other thing you need to think about is if we are going to do block scheduling and you are going to do scheduling where you're doing 2 back-to-back games, you need to allow some rest time in between. Keep in mind the temperature, keep in mind that we're trying to prevent exertional heat illnesses here. So if you're doing block scheduling, you play 3 back-to-back games and they're all an hour long on the turf and you're playing from 11 to 2, that's probably not the best idea for those participants. So really trying to mind your scheduling as it comes in mind to safety and preventing exertional heat illnesses too, providing breaks if they are needed, monitoring the weather. So scheduling is our normal kind of just slot the teams in isn't necessarily going to work in our COVID era right now.
That's great. I'm going to let you, this is something that we came across, and I'm going to let Ellis talk about this. This is amazing. And if I was running a tournament, this is something that I would ask all of my club directors and participants to be able, I would give this to them as a resource because it's going to prevent more, or it's going to prevent a bigger issue at the event.
Yep, so self-screening is becoming a very popular thing, kind of making sure our populations that we're working with are cognizant of what the signs and symptoms are of COVID-19. Have you been recently exposed to somebody who's sick? So this is a quick tool. I know the Mayo Clinic put together this one, the CDC has another one. So there's several of these that exist out there in the world already. So this is something that's a nice tool to be able to send out again in your pre-event communication. The next slide, Andy, is something we're really bad at as a society. So just saying, if you think you're sick, stay home might not be super helpful for everybody. So I'm not personally sick, but a friend of mine that I saw a week and a half ago was exposed and now I just found out, so maybe I was exposed. So giving somebody a self-assessment tool like the Mayo Clinic tool, where they can really walk through those steps and understand, like, these are what the signs and symptoms are, these are the potential risks, can really kind of give them a thought process to walk through and be like, okay, it's a self-check, it's a self-assessment. Just staying home if you think you're sick, we're bad at that as a society. Nobody takes sick days. Everybody goes into work sick. I think that this is a challenge that we have in general. So I think now more than ever, it is so important to use self-assessment tools and educate yourselves and your participants about what you should be looking for and when not to come. Another thing to think about, which Andy, maybe you want to add on this one, is what happens if a whole team is exposed and they're sick? Are you offering refunds? As an event operator, is that something that you talked about earlier? Like, are you going to be doing reimbursements? So that's something that you need to think about ahead of time too. If potentially a whole team can't come, how are you going to handle that situation? Do you want to add anything with that, Andy?
Yeah, I think that most it's hard for me to make a blanket statement because this is such unknown territory, and I know that event operators and tournament and youth sports organizations are all trying to work as hard as they can to make sure that there are opportunities to play this summer. And so I think a blanket statement is really hard. However, I would, I think as you can see, the theme in today's presentation, it's what are we doing before the event even happens? It's that simple. And so I think that if a team can't come because of that, like, again, every individual organization has a policy or will do their best. I mean, again, I would hope that everybody understands that this is unprecedented and we're all trying to get back on the field and we're all trying to compete. And so the challenge here is, like, how do we do that as safely as possible? So speaking of that, I'm not a lawyer, Ellis is not a lawyer, but if you watch John Sadler's Liability and Insurance, it's really hard if someone were to get sick and tried to say that it happened at an event, as an event operator, I strongly suggest you go back and watch John Sadler's explanation on this. It's extremely difficult as long as you have a plan. And part of that plan here is that, listen, we're in a global pandemic. If people don't know that, there is a level of assumption of risk by attending these events. But you, as an event operator, need to talk to your local council about how to best protect yourself. But one of the things that's been a recurring theme is COVID-19 waiver release agreements for not just minors, right? We just talked about that you had to do a stakeholder audit. If I was running an event, every one of my staff, every one of my athletic trainers, referees, if you want to come and work at my event, you need to understand that this could happen. And I strongly suggest that you make a call and have a conversation with someone who's way more able to talk through the assumption of risk with you. But starting point would be go listen to John Sadler because I think he was really good. Ellis, do you want to talk about signage and like why this is so important, not only for just assumption of risk, but in some of the things that you were talking about in terms of moving people through your venue?
Yep, absolutely. One of the things that we're seeing certain camps and other event operators kind of adopt is what they're doing a lot of grocery stores now, which is like the one-way traffic. So people aren't crossing paths and going back and forth. So signage, directional signage can be very important. We already talked about drop off, pickup. So where is somebody from the second they pull in the parking lot, there should be signage kind of guiding them through to limit where they are. And there's not a bunch of people crowding the registration tent asking, where do I go? Where is field 7? Everything should be pre-communicated so people can go directly to their fields. It's clearly lined, and everybody knows what's going on prior to the event. That's not a simple task. There's a lot of communication you do ahead of time. Whether people read it or not is another thing. But if on site the day of, you can create an environment where you can create crowd flows through corralling or through one-way signs. Thinking about restrooms is a big one, which I think we have another slide on. But so making sure you're highly visible and also using signs like reminding about social distancing, reminding about masks, reminding about proper hygiene. If you're feeling sick or exhibiting any of these symptoms, what do you do? Where's the athletic trainer? Where's the athletic trainer tent? Where can I find an athletic trainer? So these are all important signs that you should have on site. Really thinking also that the more visual cueing you can do and people understand where they're going to go, the less questions, the less interacting. They're going to have to flag down a field marshal and ask what's going on. So the more you can communicate non-verbally, the better it is from an exposure standpoint, from somebody just walking right up to one of your staff members and asking a question about where they should be or what team is playing on field X that day. So maybe you have a signage about the schedule up and field maps up. So really trying to create a very self-sufficient way to navigate your tournament without having to have a lot of interaction or contact points between staff and participants or spectators. Do you have anything to add?
Oh, that's great. So I'm not going to walk all the way through this. Just a quick note: if you have a question, feel free to fire it in the Q&A channel located in your menu bar, and Elsa and I are going to try to answer questions either along the way or at the end. And we will, obviously, everyone who is here will get a copy of this, look at this. But this is just some of the sample language. I can't stress this enough. Like, this is better handled by a lawyer. So it's really that simple. And this is a time when you should not hesitate to reach out to figure out the best way to communicate this. I always say that if you think about the number one company, if you talk to the number one company in the world about moving people, is Disney. And if you listen to them talk about it, it's all about moving people, and it's because of signage. And so I just strongly suggest that you really look at that venue map. You got to over communicate during this time. So Alice, you want to talk about participant packing list? Like, how would you communicate this to people?
I think it's as simple as putting it into your pre-event communication and putting it as a piece of your email, a sample packing list of what participants and parents need to pack. So one of the things that's not so remember to bring your hand sanitizer. Remember to bring your face coverings or your masks. Thinking about sunscreen, because we don't want everybody passing around the same bottle of sunscreen and being very close to each other in the sunscreen circle. Thinking about water. Are you providing water? Remember all of our patients that just put their head under the water cooler, or how many people are touching the thing to refill their water bottle. So saying, hey, we're not providing water. So you need to bring your own big giant gallon jug of water. And then that's how we're going to mitigate risk and exposure that way. Food. Are you having concessions? Are you having vendors that are going to be, or food trucks are typically kind of what we see at these tournaments? Or how are you going to feed people? Or if you're not feeding people, that needs to be communicated as well. But again, Andy, that we talked about earlier, if you do the scheduling correctly, maybe people are only on site for 2 hours. So they don't need to bring a mass amount of supplies for the day. They can get through what they need to in the 2 hours and then get off campus. And that's what you need. Do you have anything to add to that too?
Yeah, and I know this isn't really what we're talking about here, but in my mind, if I was running an event, I wouldn't have a vendor village. I would not be providing food. There's just so many other issues with people standing around and congregating in one place. And frankly, that can't exist with the idea of reducing participants in the venue and not having people congregate. So for what it's worth, if I was an event operator, if that's possible, I wouldn't be doing either of those things, because it presents a whole nother challenge that you don't need in an already challenging environment. Real quick, I'm not gonna read through this. I'm just gonna get to the next slide here. You guys can read this afterwards. I'm just gonna make it real simple. Ellis, feel free to shout it out for everybody.
Yep, just enforcing masks. It's a recommendation by the CDC. Yet again, though, you do need to keep in mind that some people might not be able to wear a mask because of certain either medical conditions or other conditions. Also, children under the age of 2 might necessarily not be wearing masks. So thinking about keeping that in mind, but also, again, another way for signage to remember the proper way to wear a mask. And it's not that it protects you or it protects me. My mask is protecting you. So it's just more of the kind of verbal cue or visual cues that you can provide. This was a discussion that we got in with Sadler in our first webinar about masks and enforcing masks. So if wearing a mask is a policy at your tournament, you need to think about how you're going to handle the situation of a parent who is adamant that they're not going to wear a mask, no matter what you say. So and is that communicated ahead of time? If you're not wearing a mask, you cannot be on site. So that is something you need to take account of and really communicate again ahead of time, because you want to be able to prepare you and your staff for those conversations of, hey, this is the correct, can you make sure you pull it up over your nose and down over your chin, making sure that they're actually wearing them appropriately and wearing them when they should be is another huge thing. So face coverings and masks, that's a situation that, again, you need to develop and have that conversation internally, communicate it externally ahead of, and understand that you set that expectation, and that is the expectation that everybody is following.
Great. So this is a big one. And again, this is pre-event, right? This is not like, oh my gosh, this is happening on the day of. Alice, do you want to quickly kind of walk through here? Notice, again, pre-event, what is your protocol for someone presenting COVID-19 symptoms? And so, Alice, can you just quickly talk through these about what you need to know?
Yep. Again, remember, this is something that you need to think about ahead of time. So what if somebody starts exhibiting symptoms at the event or they're not feeling well? First of all, where are your athletic trainers? Who is your medical professional on site who's going to be looking and evaluating at this patient? Where are you going to isolate them? So you need to be able to have an area where you can examine that patient that's not right in the flow of everybody else. You also, skipping to the bottom point, don't want to have a tent that is the COVID tent. So if everybody sees me evaluating Andy and it says COVID tent, that's a HIPAA violation. Everybody now knows that Andy's a suspected COVID patient. So making sure you're really sensitive about patient privacy protection and making sure that you're not, again, thinking about dealing and working with children. This has been a point that a lot of my teacher friends have been talking about, is bullying as related to COVID too. So really trying to protect the identity of any patient that might be suspected of having COVID-19. What's the protocol for transportation? Are they able to drive? Can they drive themselves? If it does require an ambulance transport, you need to make sure that you tell the ambulance coming that they're dealing with a potential COVID-19 patient transport, so they're ready themselves and can bring the proper equipment to be able to evaluate and take care of the patient, and also think about transporting it to the correct facility as well. So they might not be taking COVID patients to certain facilities, and they might have COVID hospitals or hospital floors in other stations. So making sure you communicate that there's a potential COVID-19 case on site when you're doing a transport as well. Documentation, what does that look like? That's something you need to figure out ahead of time. What is the follow-up procedure? And then what is the communication pathway if there is a confirmed positive? So if Andy reaches out to me and says, hey, the patient that we transported last week, it is because he does have COVID-19, you need to think about how you're going to communicate that to the participants that were there, were potentially exposed, and then thinking about doing that in a very HIPAA compliant way.
Yeah, and just real quick, Alice, because one of our Go for Alice OGs, Jay Clark, chimed in, and here's his question. During the pre-event phase of a tournament, would we, athletic trainers or coordinators, be taking temperatures of all players, coaches, and parents? So first, Jay, what's up? Good to see you on the webinar. Alice, can we talk about temperature screening real quick?
Yeah. Hi, Jay. So temperature screening is something that people are doing, and there's something that people that aren't doing. It just depends on the event operator and how they're doing it. We all know as athletic trainers, there is some evidence out there about the use of thermometers and what type of thermometer you're using to assess core body temperature. So I think that that's a total depend situation. Some event operators want to do temperature screening and they're doing it, but also thinking about if you have a hard and fast policy that's in line with the CDC about temperature screening, that if your skin temperature is over 100.4, then you're out of the tournament. Thinking about Jay, think about our lines, or we're outside all day, and thinking about your participants walking up and being in the sun all day, thinking about what their skin temperature could actually be, utilizing an instrument such as that. So if we wrote a policy, we have to stick to it, because if we're like, oh, you know what, everybody's over 100, we're just going to let people in. You can't really pivot mid tournament, because you've communicated that policy. That's the policy. You need to stick with it. So that's something you need to think about going into it, and understanding, like, what instruments are you going to be used? How are you going to be temperature screening? What is your temperature cutoff? It should be in line with best practice, which is already set forth by the CDC. So that's something that it's a total depends situation. And I think that we see some people doing it and some people don't at the moment.
Yep, great, thanks. So now we're going to shift focus, and we're going to move a little faster, because we have talked a lot about these things throughout the pre-event, because we've already come up with a plan for this. So specifically, minimizing the areas of congregation. Like I said, I would have no vendor village. I'd have no food vendor. I'd have no water filling stations. And I have no team tents. The challenge here is, have you communicated that to everybody ahead of time? And I think at this point, everyone gets the idea that that's what we're harping on. You've got to communicate ahead of time. And the participants need to know what's going to be there. And the one thing I'll say from an event operator perspective is, like, our goal here is to have kids competing again on the field. Everyone's been sitting around for 3.5 months. The rest of the experience, at least if I was running an event, would not be such a priority. The priority needs to be safety and being able to put on an event that fulfills, kids competing again out on the field. Ellis, I don't know if you have much to add to this. We've kind of like touched this on every slide so far.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with everything you said. Again, it's just, how can we minimize the amount of time people are in a group or together? And I think that a lot of that says it. Again, this is not one size fits all. Again, this is venue specific. So if you're in an indoor tournament, have they shut off the water fountains, things like that. And maybe putting signage of water fountain is off on the sign, because we're going to have everybody just walking up and hitting the water thing just to see if it's on. And again, that's a huge point of contact where people are going to be touching. So again, thinking about all of that going ahead and communicating it ahead of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. So during the event, I'm gonna cruise to this. So, you really did. Again, there's no blanket statement here. Every venue is different. Every venue has its own challenges. Like, in the summer, there's a lot of fields going on, and some of these fields are backed up side next to each other. So this sort of setup is not set in stone, because everything is different. Every venue is different. And so the bottom line is that you've got to figure out a way that limits the places where players, coaches, spectators don't back into each other, are not violating the social distancing rules. And so, you might think about in your scheduling that you have fields on and off, open field, closed field. I know that gets really challenging when you're trying to put on an event for 80 to 100 teams, but you really need to think about this. Alice, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm already looking at those closed fields, and I'm thinking teams are definitely going to warm up on those closed fields, right? So really having a lot of signage there, or communicating ahead of time, like, hey, this is a closed field, it's for social distancing, or people are going to want to sit chairs on that closed field and be able to sit 6 feet away from each other. So really thinking about how you're going to be enforcing some of these rules about physically spacing people out. And again, it might just be having to run caution tape around and having to really just be like, this is closed, you cannot come in here. Because as we know, we've run how many tournaments where certain fields have been closed, and every half an hour we have to go up there and be like, sorry, the field's closed, can't use it. Again, that was a pre-COVID era, but old habits die hard. So I think that it would be, this is going to be a challenging thing, but again, just always playing the what if game. And what if they want to do this? Oh, and making sure you're sticking by your rules, and enforcing them on site.
Yep. And I mean, this is, again, we don't really need to spend any time on this. This is pretty self-explanatory. Like, you should 6 feet, social distancing, figure out a way to pull that off.
And visual cues like on the sideline. So whether having X's drawn on the sideline, measure out 6 feet, whether it's a cone. So really remember 6 feet, it might be hard for some of our participants to understand what 6 feet are. And some signs say, well, it's 2 arms length away. Well, not everybody has a 6 foot wingspan, especially if you're in 3rd grade. So it might be really hard for them. So visual cues are huge. So putting X's on the sidelines where this is where you stand, this is this, and this is this. Also, let's think about altering the rules of how substitutions work. So if Andy and I have a lacrosse background, so sorry, we always bring up lacrosse, but there's a substitution box, right? You have to run through the box. Well, maybe why don't we just make it you can fly in and off the sideline? So you're not crossing everybody on your team. You're not crossing like the other team by subbing in through a box, and maybe making the whole sideline a box where you can sub in and out on the fly. I just made that up. Do you like it?
I do. I'm not sure coaches are going to love that, the sideline being the entire substitution box. But you know what? For safety, Ellis, I'll do it just
Thanks.
for you. So face coverings and masks. Ellis, do you want to talk about, I know we've had a couple questions about, are people wearing face masks when they play? Like, what is your suggestion on this?
Again, this is a depends situation. The CDC says that if you can comfortably wear a mask and exercise, then you can. But again, if you have some sort of condition, whether it's asthma, claustrophobia, or any other reason why you couldn't or shouldn't wear your mask, maybe it's an equipment specific. So if you have a helmet or another sort of piece of equipment that you wear, where that's going to end up being an issue, then if you have an issue, then you don't necessarily have to wear it. Another one that they definitely stress is do not wear a mask while swimming. You can't breathe if your mask is wet and pressed up against your face. Face masks during participation, the CDC says if you can comfortably do it, then they advise it. But if you can't for some other reason, then you don't need to.
Yep. So signage, again, these are 3 signs that Ellis and I came up with that should be all over your venue in some way, shape, or form. And frankly, this is part of your plan that you've already come up with, where people are entering, things like that. But these are the signs that, the bare minimum, you need to have throughout your venue. Ellis, you'd agree, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think I have a list of like 13 other signs that I want on my tournament in my head.
Amazing. Great. So before we get, lightning, this is huge. And by the way, everybody, it is National Lightning Awareness Week, if you didn't know that. And so this is our awareness slide. And Ellis, but you can talk about how COVID-19 prevents potential issues with lightning delays.
Absolutely. So this is something that we also, as we're coming up with a whole pre-event plan and thinking about returning to sport in such a large fashion, we also need to re-examine our current safety protocols and practices that we're doing. So typically lightning delays, it's thunder roars, go indoors. So we all go to the field house, or we all go into the whatever it is, concession stands. There's different lightning shelters that all of us use at all of our different venues. So this is something that you need to think about, and a policy that you need to communicate ahead of time. As we know, thunderstorms can come out of nowhere, and it could be a beautiful day, and the next thing you know, it's hailing. So this is something that needs to be organized ahead of time, and you can really make sure that you communicate where you're going to all your participants ahead of time. So maybe we're not going into the field house anymore. We should just go to our cars, because that's we don't want everybody confined in a small area. Again, this is a participant number challenge. It's a venue number. It's an architecture challenge. So it's really thinking about your venue specific lightning policy and re-examining that with a COVID lens over your eyes.
Yeah, just in case you were wondering, National Lightning Awareness Week was started in 2001 for anybody out there that was curious. So lightning, this is a big thing we need to talk about. Again, pre-event, you should have this all planned out. Everybody's favorite topic at an event, at a tournament, bathrooms. Ellis, would you please do the honor and tell everybody here how we're going to mitigate infection with bathroom considerations?
Well, again, this could be solved, or at least this problem could be confined or whittled down a little bit. If we're thinking about scheduling and you're here for 2 hours, then you're gone. That would be ideal, right? Nobody needs to use the bathroom. But you should obviously be providing people with bathrooms. So thinking about, are you going to have porta potties on site? Are you going to have indoor bathrooms only? What's the geography of the bathrooms? What is the architecture of the bathrooms themselves? So are the stalls 6 feet apart? Or are you going to shut down every other stall and then that'll allow for social distancing? Are you having a bathroom attendant who is in charge of only allowing one person in the bathroom at a time or 2 people in the bathroom at a time? Again, this is a venue specific problem. This is something that you need to think about. And also thinking about both like gendered bathrooms. So like urinals are different than stalls. So like how are you going to address bathrooms as in a holistic way and not just solve it for one scenario? Thinking about also cleaning staff, so extra custodial staff who are there to help clean the bathrooms in between people, or making sure that there's at least enough hand sanitizer in the bathroom, things like that, where you can make sure they're monitoring soap. So bathrooms are, Andy and I talked for a while about bathrooms, and it's a hard problem to solve, but again, it's a case-by-case scenario, and it's just something you need to kind of think about. Definitely want signage encouraging proper hand hygiene in the bathroom, because maybe that's one of the only opportunities that they get to wash their hands that day, so you don't want them skipping that opportunity on site. Do you have anything to add about bathrooms?
No, I've heard enough about bathrooms. It's a lot of work to maintain the cleanliness and being able to pull this off. So hopefully your scheduling, your plan reduces the number of people that actually need to go to the bathroom at the venue. You want to talk a little bit about List N real quick? This is just a highly technical term for a list of disinfectant products. Again, if I was an event operator, I would be outsourcing this to somebody, or depending on what my contractual obligations are with my venue, I would be able to talk to them about like, okay, well, what are you doing to make sure that the bathrooms are clean? So those are things that's a conversation that I would think would take place in your pre-event planning. But Ellis, do you want to talk briefly about List N?
Yep, absolutely. So List N is a list that the EPA put together about approved disinfectants that can be used for COVID-19. Everything from wipes, concentrate, sprays. So there's all different ways that we can sanitize areas and their uses. There's another one. I believe the CDC also has a list out there of approved cleaning disinfectant supplies as well. So you can consult both lists. You can consult List N, but I think it's this is just another resource for if you are in that one of the first phases of pre-event planning, thinking about bathrooms and just sanitizing and providing sanitizing equipment to your staff and your participants and spectators, making sure that they're approved and you're using the correct stuff, as opposed to just kind of buying whatever you found at whatever store you were at that day.
Yep. Great. So post-tournament, and this is usually on my other webinars, I put up a slide that says, okay, someone presenting COVID-19 symptoms walks up to the registration tent. Like, what do you do? And I put that in front of Alice, and she talks about what she would do that. But now, because this is something that's starting to happen in the sports world, is what happens if there's a confirmed positive COVID case at your event, Ellis? And how does that impact the event operator in this case? Obviously, we'll talk more about having a COVID coordinator in a minute, but how would you handle this as an event operator?
So if you have a confirmed positive, obviously this is post-tournament. Somebody was at your tournament, they were either exhibiting symptoms then or after, and they contact you to say, hey, I was at your tournament a couple days ago, I've been diagnosed with COVID-19. Again, this is a tricky thing because of HIPAA, and some people may not feel comfortable sharing that with the event operator. So it could go unreported as well, but it's something that if it is reported to you, how are you going to say that and communicate that to everybody who was there? So you should let everybody know that, hey, you might have been exposed because you were at our tournament, and understanding that that's probably the best thing to do. But again, that's something that you need to discuss pre-event and understand and communicate to the participants and their parents, hey, if there is a potential COVID-19 exposure, we will be alerting you, and this is how we're going to do it. So parents know that after they go home to maybe check their email. If they see an email coming from Andy Hayes, what is that? it might be that we were potentially exposed to COVID. So thinking about what is the plan and how you're going to communicate that ahead of time so that everybody knows and has the expectation that you're going to handle that situation appropriately.
And Alice, quick question that just came in. So if you have an athlete that becomes ill and they visit the AT and they're sent home, let's say, and they have to leave, does the athletic trainer have to leave too? But in hopes, I would think they would have the proper PPE on so they would be able to fulfill their responsibilities. Great question.
That is a good question. Again, I think this comes down to thinking about staffing ahead of time as well. So again, proper PPE is huge. So remember, as athletic trainers, we need to remember to protect ourselves since we are healthcare professionals. So having our appropriate PPE with us and understanding that this is a potential scenario that could very well happen. So, and then also properly disposing of your PPE that you've had. So again, if the athletic trainer, so Andy, if the athletic trainer then says, hey, I don't feel comfortable evaluating patients for the rest of the day, I'm going home, you need to be prepared for that too. If they make that decision on their own, then you should probably have overstaffed medical staff that day just to make sure that you are prepared for situations like that. Another way that a lot of people are handling this, like if you look at the way hospitals handle this scenario, is that they had one attending at first assigned to the floor and they only had one physician working with the COVID-19 patient. So maybe you have one person that is prepared to take on that task. So it's kind of something you could model after what the hospitals have done, doing things floor by floor and doing it that way. But again, I think you just need to be prepared for somebody to say, hey, I'm not comfortable being here. I need to go home now, and I'm going to go self-quarantine for 14 days.
Great. So a couple other questions that are really good about lightning. So people are excited about National Lightning Awareness Week as much as I am. Great point, though. If you are going to drop kids off and parents are going to leave, what happens if there's lightning? Like, where do the kids go? And so just as an event operator, and, I would not feel comfortable having kids playing in a venue with weather potential if parents were not in the park. And again, you have to start thinking about your scheduling again and making sure that you have enough room for that. But that is a great question. You can't, I think that's going to be a venue by venue decision, and the event operators need to have, you're going to send kids to their cars when weather happens, then you need the parents to still be there. So just I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that was a great question too.
That is a great question. Another thing, also thinking about really planning ahead of time and trying to predict that happening. So if you see a line of thunderstorms is coming through, maybe you just cancel the afternoon. So we don't even get into that situation and you prevent it entirely and say, hey, if you're playing from 2 o'clock on, it's canceled for the rest of the day. There's inclement weather coming in. And you don't want that scenario to even happen. So really making sure you're monitoring the weather is another way to kind of prevent that from happening.
Yep. Okay, so we're in the home stretch here. I appreciate everyone's patience. I hope this has been helpful. I'm just going to get on my soapbox real quick because I've been lucky enough to work with Ellis for a very long time in my former life as the CEO of Next Sports. We made a decision to hire a medical professional in Ellis way back when. I would not be running a tournament in 2020 without somebody in charge of my mitigation response and plan. That's just the reality. One, I'm trying to manage the rest of the business and the rest of my customers and the rest of the venues and all the other relationships that need to. Most people are not as well versed on the medical side of what you need to be aware of. And this is somebody's full-time gig going into a tournament. It's really that simple. And the COVID coordinator is not somebody who's like responsible for necessarily for injured athletes on the sideline. This is someone who would probably, in my mind, Ellis, you feel free to chime in here, would have both non-clinical and clinical responsibilities as it relates to that. Like, this is the medical professional that's going to help me put on the safest tournament ever. And if anything were to ever happen, and you were put in some sort of legal situation, the fact that you have somebody in charge of this plan who's worked with you, worked with local and health departments, local and state health departments, is going to be something that's going to make the event way better. And more importantly, your customers and the parents and the kids are going to feel confident about coming to your event. So if I was still running events, this would be my primary focus, is like, who can I find to be in charge of all of this? And oddly enough, okay, Ellis, would you like to talk about athletic trainers briefly, about what they are capable of and why they tend to be the perfect COVID coordinator?
Absolutely. So I think that we're seeing sports return, and we're seeing a lot of recommendations that are being made at the moment. If you look at some of the panels that are there, I get a little bit frustrated because not all the time are there athletic trainers in the conversations, coming from these different position statements put out by states or NGBs or whatnot. I think that this is a perfect moment for our profession. Sports are coming back, whether we like it or not, and it's our problem to deal with, or it's our time to shine. You can look at it that way in a more positive light. And I think we're really well suited to do this. Policy development is something that we do. Prevention is our number one goal at all times. So this pre-event phase of me asking Andy, can we change the entire sideline to a substitution box, is a perfect example of, he would probably never think that because he's only ever used a substitution box. So like, this is a perfect way where we can try and help problem solve and help an event operator really run the safest event possible. Think of yourself as a safety consultant. So we're responsible and can help develop these policies with the event operator, poke holes. Again, like you saw, Andy and I just agreed on several things today. He even talked me back into back to doing video because we can limit crowds. So there's a lot of different things that you just need to be able to draft and redraft with your event operator. And I think event operators are missing a huge opportunity if they don't engage athletic trainers in this conversation about how to best return to sport. So again, emergency planning and preparedness, that's what we do, right? We've all written EAPs. Some of us have written hundreds of EAPs. And thinking about how are we going to handle an emergency situation through a COVID lens too. So this is something that we are trained to do, we are ready to do, and we do on a regular basis. Prevention is our number one goal always. HIPAA, we are all trained in HIPAA. We all love our HIPAA courses that we have to take all the time. So that is something that we are very well prepared to be able to handle the patient privacy of somebody that if they have sustained an injury or if they can come down with COVID or suspected COVID-19 case. One thing that I think we also kind of get pigeonholed into is that musculoskeletal vertical, which I don't want to undermine, because I think as we do return to these tournament settings, a lot of our participants have been inside for several months. Maybe they were doing individual training, maybe they weren't, maybe they've only done a couple practices, but again, I think we're going to see a major increase in musculoskeletal injuries as people return to competition, especially in the tournament setting, which is why another reason I would think you would, as an event operator, you'd want to almost overstaff here, because we're going to see an increase in injury rates. But also, we have the orthopedic vertical that we've done, but another huge part of our training is illness and general illness training, and being able to evaluate a patient when they walk in the room and say, I don't feel well. So I think that is something that's not stressed enough about our skill set, is kind of our primary care skills and how we're able to handle scenarios like a COVID-19 evaluation. Documentations of injury and illness, again, this is something that we do regularly. If somebody is sick, if somebody is injured, we always write up the injury note on it. Somebody asked a question earlier, and I didn't get to it yet, but about how do you, sorry, there's a couple of them. How do you recommend event operators get their staff properly trained to manage all pre-event, during, and after event communications? Here you go. This is how you do it. You hire a COVID coordinator. You have somebody who is, we're used to coach education, right? We do concussion education, we do CPR, we do lots of other things. So I think that we really, as a profession, are well suited as the return to youth sport comes back, as the return to school sports come back. This is somewhere we should be inserting ourselves, thinking about, how are we going to handle this scenario? How are we going to handle this scenario? And I think that if you're not involved in these conversations already, it's really time for us to shine as a profession and really step out there as the experts in this field, of being like, this is how we manage and mitigate risk in these scenarios. Off my soapbox.
No, no, you're not. No, no, no. I'm jumping on the soapbox with you. As an event operator who ran over 70 events a year for a long time, and Ellis, I got to work with Ellis. I cannot stress to everybody who's an event operator or a tournament organizer on here, having somebody who is a medical professional who is helping you on a regular basis. Let's forget COVID-19. I mean, that just adds a whole nother level to this. But if you don't have athletic trainers at your events, you're really doing a disservice to the participants and all the stakeholders. So COVID coordinator aside, athletic trainers are very, very important to putting on a great event. And it's really that simple. You add in COVID-19, I don't know how, with all of the variables that go into running a great tournament, a operations and tournament organizer can think about all of these things that have to do with COVID-19 and be able to run an event. So I strongly suggest that as an event operator, you take ownership of preparing for COVID-19 world and hiring a medical professional to help you. And like I said, it was the best thing we did as a company in our former life at Next. And I strongly suggest it today, even more so. So that concludes kind of our information here. And I'm going to kind of like dive down here and try to get to as many questions as I can. Ellis, you would probably know this. Have there been any recommendations on protecting ourselves during giving CPR? Are the traditional one-way masks still okay, or should we be doing bag valve only? Do you know that?
That's from my good friend Beth Wolf. So to be completely honest, I don't know that yet. That was a question that I was asked the other day. If anybody knows the answer, feel free to chat it in. But so I would think that if we're doing bag valve masks, that would obviously allow you to distance a little bit further from the patient. I don't know if there's recommendations yet. I did read something the other day about, obviously this is not for the professional rescuer, but it was somebody talking about, it was on the American Heart Association's website talking about chest only compressions, but that was more for the lay rescuer, not the professional rescuer. So that's a great question, Beth. I think that's something I need to look into again. But I don't know the answer, to be completely honest with you.
Yep. Okay. My apologies. Sorry about that. Put you on the spot there, but we will get the answer and be able, because as the questions come in, we'll be able to follow up with everybody. I know we have a lot of questions about, are the slides going to be available, previous webinars? All of those things are going to be emailed out to you following the, in about 48 hours following the end of the webinar, as it needs to just download and get uploaded. So this is super interesting, Ellis. So after the tournament, should everyone self-quarantine for 14 days or only if there was a confirmed positive case? So I'm going to piggyback this because it just actually came across the screen. If New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut are now suggesting that if you come into these areas from out of state and high COVID-19 areas, you need to quarantine for 14 days, which means if you're holding a tournament on Long Island or in one of these states, and you've got teams coming from whatever they determine are those high COVID-19, you need to really think about that and what that actually means, because I don't know how you fly in on Friday, quarantine for 14 days, and then play a tournament the next day on Saturday. There's a math problem in there. But specifically on that question, the 14 days, my answer would be you have to look at local and state guidelines, correct?
Yeah, I think that there's I think that is a local state guideline. I think that if you know you're exposed, it's probably best practice to self-quarantine. If you absolutely know you were the person taking care of that patient, or you know that maybe that was the, so I think that that's a self-quarantine. If it were me, I would probably self-quarantine. Again, I always pretty much err on the conservative side. And me as a healthcare professional, I would not want to do more harm and then go to another tournament and then potentially infect every patient that I came in contact with because I'm a carrier now. So I think that that's something that's is something that I think you should read the state guidelines, read the national guidelines, see what the recommendations are. Again, Andy, that's something good point to point out though, is that geography is so important here and it's going to change. And I know that we basically are very, we are in as especially in the youth tournament world, it's very much a travel-based tournament. So maybe as a club coach, you're thinking about, we shouldn't go to a tournament in Texas. We shouldn't go that far. And that's really what the CDC recommends, is they don't want a lot of travel going on right now. They really want you to kind of stay in our communities, right? I mean, now we're in yellow, and we have a yellow phase in Pennsylvania, and we're headed to green. And so just thinking about the populations that you yourself are exposing, and the populations that you're bringing into a tournament, where they're coming from, and potentially limiting, like geography is very important right now, to try and mitigate the spread of this. You don't want people hopping on a plane, then hopping on a plane, and hopping on a plane, and next thing you know, every airport has now COVID patients flying through it. So
yeah, great. No, that's fine. So it's 12:10. It's been 70 minutes. I think Ellis and I want to thank all of you and all of the previous participants in all 4 of our webinars. We want to give a special shout out to Brian Murray, who, if you're in the AT world, you know, is our marketing brand guru who put all of these together. And frankly, that's on the shoulders of us interacting with event operators, with our own group of people at Go for Ellis, and coming up with what we think could be helpful to all event operators and frankly athletic trainers as we move into this sort of unprecedented time where there is a virus, there is youth sports, and how do we get back on the field. So if you have any other questions or concerns, hit us up at contactus@goforellis.com. If you need an athletic trainer, obviously that's what we do. We have almost 11,000 athletic trainers on our platform, all over the country. We are staffing hundreds and hundreds of shifts every day. So check us out. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And Ellis, as always, thank you for all of your insight.
thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody.